There is a version of World War I that most people carry in their heads without ever questioning it. It involves mud and sacrifice, poets and generals, a war that was supposed to end all wars. It involves bronze statues in town squares and names carved into granite. It involves a kind of noble suffering, distant and resolved. That version is almost entirely false. Not in its details necessarily, but in its emotional architecture. The war was not noble. It was not resolved. It did not end anything. What it did, quietly and with extraordinary efficiency, was teach an entire civilization how to absorb mass death without flinching. It taught governments how to process human beings as units. It taught doctors how to sort the living from the dying by time available rather than chance of survival. It taught soldiers how to eat beside corpses and sleep through artillery and report for duty with pieces of their minds already gone. And then, when it was over, those lessons did not disappear. They settled into institutions, into medicine, into bureaucracy, into the language of war itself, and they have never fully left. What follows is not a celebration of courage or a catalogue of atrocities. It is something more unsettling than either of those things. It is an account of how certain behaviors, certain habits of mind and body and institutional practice became normalized inside the machinery of the First World War and then spread outward into the world that came after. Some of these habits were physical, some were psychological, some were administrative. All of them emerged from the same basic condition. That 4 years of industrialized killing on a scale no one had anticipated required, in order to function, the systematic reduction of human beings to manageable data. The war did not break the world. It reorganized it. And the reorganization happened so completely, so thoroughly, that we are still living inside the results. The first thing to understand is that the Western Front was not primarily a battlefield in any traditional sense. It was a managed system. By the end of 1914, within months of the war's start, the lines had hardened into something that no general on either side had planned for, and none of them knew how to end. A continuous stretch of fortified trench ran from the North Sea coast of Belgium southward through France to the Swiss border, nearly 500 miles of excavated earth, sandbags, barbed wire, duckboards, dugouts, and dead men. The generals kept calling for advances. The advances kept failing. The lines barely moved, and in the space between those two facts, an entirely new way of living was constructed, underground, under fire, under the constant administrative pressure of armies that needed to keep their records straight, even as their soldiers dissolved into the landscape. The men who lived in those trenches developed habits because habits were how you stayed sane. Routine was the only structure available when everything external was chaos. You woke at stand 2 before dawn. You stood on the fire step with your rifle. You watched the wire in the gray light. You waited for an attack that usually did not come, and then you stood down and went about the business of surviving another day. That routine became so fixed, so deeply ingrained, that men who survived the war and came home could not shake it for years. They woke before dawn automatically. They flinched at cars backfiring. They could not sleep in silence because silence in the trenches had always meant something was about to happen. The habit of constant vigilance was the first thing the war manufactured at scale. Before 1914, most of the men who would serve had lived lives of relative predictability. They were farmers, factory workers, clerks, tradesmen. Their nervous systems were calibrated for civilian rhythms. The war recalibrated those systems entirely. The body learned to stay partially alert even during sleep because the sound of a shell, the creak of wire, the particular quality of silence before a raid, these things carried information that could mean the difference between living and dying. After years of that recalibration, the nervous system did not simply reset when the war ended. The habit of hypervigilance became a permanent feature of millions of men's inner lives. Physicians noticed it. They called it shell shock, or neurasthenia, or war neurosis. depending on their theoretical preferences, and most of them treated it as a moral failing rather than a physiological reality. The habit of dismissing that kind of damage as weakness was itself one of the things the war normalized, and it outlasted the trenches by decades. Sleep deprivation was not incidental to trench life. It was structural. The standard rotation in many sectors kept men in the front line for 4 to 6 days at a time, then moved them back to support trenches, then reserve, then briefly out of the line entirely before the cycle began again. During their time in the front line, true sleep was nearly impossible. Artillery could open at any hour. Gas alarms required immediate action. Raids were launched at night. The men who were not on watch still could not fully rest because the environment itself denied rest. The dugouts were damp, cold, infested with rats and lice, and acoustically continuous with the outside world. A shell landing 50 yards away shook the earth you were sleeping on. After weeks and months of this, the men developed a particular skill: the ability to fall instantly and completely asleep during any available moment, regardless of conditions, and to wake fully alert at the first signal of danger. This was not a talent. It was an adaptation, and it was one that veterans brought home with them, along with the inability to maintain normal sleep when the danger signals were absent. The rats of the Western Front deserve specific attention, not for dramatic effect, but because the human relationship with them illustrates something precise about how the war worked on the minds and habits of the men who fought it. The trenches were ideal rat habitat. There was abundant food in the form of human remains, food waste, and the contents of dead men's packs. There was shelter in the form of tunneled earth. There was warmth. The rat population on the Western Front was, by any reasonable estimate, enormous. And the rats were not shy. They grew large. They moved in daylight. They ran across sleeping men's faces. They ate through kit and ration bags. And when men had been dead long enough, they ate the men themselves. The initial reaction of soldiers to this was disgust and revulsion, which was entirely normal. But revulsion is not sustainable as a permanent emotional state. After weeks in the trenches, most men developed a different relationship with the rats. Not affection exactly, but a kind of flat acceptance. The rats were there. They were going to continue to be there. Killing them was temporarily satisfying but made no lasting difference. Some men gave the rats names. Some left them food deliberately. The habit being formed was not fondness for vermin. It was the habit of accommodation, of adjusting one's expectations of what a living environment should contain downward to match whatever the environment actually provided. That habit of downward adjustment applied to everything, to the smell of unburied bodies, to the presence of human remains in the walls of the trenches themselves, because the dead were frequently buried where they fell, and trenches were frequently dug through previously inhabited ground, to the sound of men dying within earshot. The war manufactured a tolerance for conditions that should not be tolerable, and it did so through simple, repeated exposure, and the men it manufactured that tolerance in were never entirely the same afterward. The management of the dead was one of the most revealing administrative practices of the entire war. In previous conflicts, the dead had been treated with at least a degree of ceremony, whether from religious obligation or simple human instinct. The scale of the First World War made ceremony operationally impossible for most deaths, and the response of the military bureaucracies on all sides was characteristic. They created systems. The British Army alone maintained a graves registration unit, whose function was to document the location of burials, assign reference numbers, and maintain records. When the records were incomplete, which was frequently, soldiers were listed as missing rather than dead, which had the additional administrative benefit of delaying pension payments to their families. The paperwork surrounding death was meticulous in its intentions and chaotic in its execution, because the conditions under which men died rarely permitted orderly documentation. A man blown apart by a direct shell hit left nothing to register. A man drowned in mud left no recoverable body. The system responded to this by generating categories: known dead, presumed dead, missing, believed, killed. Each category had its own administrative implications. Each category represented a way of managing human loss through bureaucratic language, and the habit of using bureaucratic language to manage human loss, of replacing the specificity of individual death with administrative classification, was one of the most durable products of the war. The British Army's approach to shell shock illustrates this bureaucratic management of human reality with particular clarity. Shell shock as a clinical phenomenon was observed from the earliest months of the war. Men arrived at casualty clearing stations with no visible physical wounds, but unable to speak, unable to walk, trembling uncontrollably, vacant, or screaming. The initial military response was to treat this as cowardice or malingering, which had the administrative advantage of keeping the men in the system rather than discharging them as disabled. Officers who showed symptoms were more likely to receive a medical diagnosis and be sent to a proper hospital. Enlisted men were more likely to be returned to their units after a brief rest period and, if they continued to display symptoms, to be charged under military discipline. The diagnosis of shell shock was officially discouraged in British military communications from 1917 onward because the War Office was concerned about the pension implications of acknowledging psychological casualties at scale. Instead, the preferred term became not yet diagnosed nervous, which had the benefit of implying that the condition was temporary and the soldier might still be returned to duty. This habit of institutional denial, of managing an inconvenient medical reality through terminology rather than treatment, outlived the war and became standard practice in military and civilian institutions dealing with traumatic injury for the better part of the 20th century. The food of the Western Front was not designed to nourish human beings in any meaningful sense. It was designed to deliver sufficient calories to keep men functional as fighting units, and even that limited goal was frequently not met. The standard British ration included bully beef, which was tinned corned beef of variable quality, hardtack biscuits that were often stale or insect-infested, tea, and occasional issues of jam, cheese, or fresh bread when supply lines permitted. In practice, rations were frequently delayed, reduced, or corrupted by the conditions of delivery. Food brought up to frontline trenches often arrived cold, contaminated with mud, or partially consumed by rats. Men who had been in the line for several days were often hungry in a way that went beyond discomfort into something more fundamental, a grinding, constant depletion that affected judgment and temper and physical endurance. The response to this was scavenging. Men developed an acute attention to any possible food source. They ate things that civilians would not have considered food. They developed an intimacy with their own hunger that most of them had never experienced before and never entirely forgot afterward. Veterans of the trenches frequently displayed food-related habits that puzzled their families for decades. The compulsion to finish everything on a plate, the hoarding of food, the inability to waste even small quantities, the anxiety triggered by the prospect of shortage. These were not neuroses. They were learned responses to a real condition, habits formed under pressure and never fully unlearned. Water was a more immediate problem than food for much of the war. The trenches were saturated with water from rainfall, groundwater, and the water table, but that water was not drinkable. It was contaminated with everything the war produced: human and animal waste, decomposing organic matter, chemical runoff from artillery, mud containing the remnants of years of human habitation. Clean water was carried up to the front in petrol cans, which imparted their own flavor to everything cooked or brewed in them. The water shortage produced a particular relationship with tea that went beyond British cultural habit into something physiologically specific. Tea, brewed strong and sweet, was the primary means by which men in the trenches obtained both calories from sugar and the psychological comfort of warmth and routine. The tea ration was treated as nearly sacred. The small primus stoves on which tea was brewed were maintained with an attention that rivaled the maintenance of weapons. The ritual of brewing and drinking tea in conditions that made the ritual absurd, under shell fire, in the dark, in water up to the knees, was a way of asserting continuity with a world that still operated by normal rules. The habit was real. The comfort was real, and the desperate quality of the attachment to that comfort was also real, a measure of how little else was available. Trench foot was not a dramatic injury. It was a slow, grinding medical condition produced by prolonged exposure to cold, wet conditions, and it was almost entirely preventable. The solution was dry socks and the periodic inspection and drying of feet. The British Army issued instructions on this from early in the war. Officers were responsible for ensuring their men changed their socks regularly and applied whale oil to their feet to reduce moisture absorption. The fact that trench foot remained a significant cause of medical evacuation throughout the war is a precise measure of the gap between institutional instruction and operational reality. Men in the front line often could not remove their boots for days at a time because removing boots in a trench meant losing the ability to move quickly under attack. The whale oil was frequently unavailable, delayed in supply, or used for other purposes. The inspections were often perfunctory or impossible in darkness and under fire. Trench foot developed quietly, without dramatic onset. The feet went numb, which felt like relief after the constant cold. Then the numbness was followed by tingling, then pain, then swelling, then, in serious cases, tissue death. Men evacuated for trench foot were sometimes accused of having deliberately neglected their feet to avoid frontline service. The habit this produced was a specific kind of stoicism, a trained reluctance to report medical problems before they became catastrophic, because the culture of the military medicine system treated early complaint as moral weakness. That reluctance to report, that internalized pressure to manage physical deterioration silently, became a pattern that veterans carried with them and that shaped the way entire generations of men related to their own bodies and their own pain. Gas was introduced to the Western Front by the Germans at Ypres in April 1915, and it changed the nature of fear in the trenches in a specific way. Before gas, the threats were primarily mechanical. Shells, bullets, grenades, the physical instruments of conventional warfare. Gas was different. It was invisible in many of its forms, odorless in some, and it worked on the interior of the body in ways that were particularly horrifying to men who had some basis for comparison. Chlorine gas, the first used in mass quantities, caused the lungs to fill with fluid. Victims drowned in their own respiratory secretions over the course of hours. Phosgene was more insidious, often showing no symptoms for 24 hours before causing pulmonary edema and heart failure. Mustard gas, introduced later, was a vesicant that damaged any moist tissue it contacted, causing blistering of the skin, the eyes, the throat, the lungs, and, in men who had been in contaminated ground, damage to the genitals and inner thighs from ground-level vapor. The gas mask became the most essential piece of personal equipment on the Western Front, and the habit of gas mask maintenance became a ritual as important as any religious observance. Men checked their masks before sleep. They knew the specific sounds of the gas alarm well enough to wake from deep sleep and have the mask on in under 10 seconds. They became attentive to wind direction, to particular smells, to the behavior of birds and animals in the area, because the natural world often provided early warning that the chemical instruments did not. This constant chemical alertness, this habit of reading the environment for invisible danger, was another permanent acquisition. Veterans flinched at particular smells for the rest of their lives. The smell of almonds, associated with some forms of cyanide-based agents, could produce an immediate physical response in men who had served on the gas-heavy sectors of the front. The smell of freshly cut grass, produced by phosgene decomposing in air, was similarly triggering. The war created a new relationship between the human nose and fear, and that relationship did not end with the armistice. The practice of fragging, the killing of officers by their own men, is typically discussed in the context of the Vietnam War, but it was present on the Western Front as well, though the historical record on this is deliberately incomplete for reasons that should be obvious. The British Army's culture of discipline created specific pressure points. Officers who were regarded by their men as recklessly indifferent to casualties, who ordered attacks on positions with no tactical value while remaining safely behind the line, who applied regulations with vindictive precision while contributing nothing to the survival of their unit, were occasionally dealt with by their own men during an engagement. A shot from behind in the confusion of an assault. A grenade whose origin was unverifiable. A report of death in action that contained no witness discrepancy because everyone present understood the nature of what had occurred and maintained silence. The habit being described here is not primarily one of violence against officers. It is the habit of collective silence in the face of institutional wrong, the habit of the group protecting itself through coordinated omission, of understanding that certain truths were too dangerous to be spoken, and that survival sometimes required complicity. This habit was present throughout the war in many forms. The unwillingness to report a comrade for a rules violation. The collective maintenance of fictions that protected the unit. The understanding that the official version of events and the actual events occupied separate registers, and that the official version was to be supported regardless of its relationship to reality. The medical system behind the Western Front was one of the organizational achievements of the war, and it was also one of the mechanisms through which human expendability was most efficiently institutionalized. The system was designed around the principle of triage, which was not a new concept in 1914, but had never been applied at quite this industrial scale. Triage meant sorting. It meant making rapid decisions about which casualties were worth treating based on available resources and probable outcomes. Men with minor wounds who could be quickly returned to duty were treated first. Men with serious but survivable wounds were treated next. Men who were unlikely to survive regardless of treatment were labeled expectant and set aside to die. This was rational medicine in conditions of extreme resource constraint. It was also a system that required the medical personnel operating it to perform every day. The act of classifying human beings as not worth treating. The habit that this produced was not callousness precisely, but a kind of managed emotional distance that was necessary for the system to function, and that over time became the default mode of engagement, not just with casualties, but with human suffering generally. Nurses who served in the casualty clearing stations described a specific process of internal adjustment, a deliberate suppression of normal emotional response that allowed them to function. Some described it as putting something away that they were never quite able to find again afterward. The medical system required this adjustment. It trained people for it, and the trained capacity for managed distance from suffering, the professional ability to process human pain as a category rather than a specificity, was another habit that outlived its original context. The burial practices of the Western Front evolved under conditions that made conventional burial increasingly impossible, and produced, in response, a set of institutional habits that reshaped how the modern world thinks about military death. The first issue was the problem of unidentifiable remains. A significant proportion of the men who died on the Western Front were killed by artillery, and a high explosive shell falling within a few meters of a human body could destroy it so completely that no identifiable fragment remained. Men simply ceased to exist as physical entities. The military response to this was the identity disc, a small aluminum tag worn around the neck, giving name, number, and religion. But identity discs were frequently separated from the bodies they were meant to identify, either by the force of the explosion, by burial in mud, by removal by scavengers, or by the simple dissolution of organic material over time. The result was that a significant proportion of Western Front dead were buried, when they were buried at all, as unknowns. The graves registration units maintained records of unknown burials keyed to map coordinates, and after the war a massive effort was made to identify as many as possible with limited success. The tomb of the unknown warrior, unveiled in Westminster Abbey in 1920, and the similar monuments in France, the United States, and elsewhere, are cultural products of this administrative failure. The unknown warrior is not primarily a symbol of sacrifice, though it has been interpreted that way. It is a symbol of the industrial scale at which identity itself was destroyed by the war. The habit it normalized was the practice of symbolic commemoration as a substitute for actual accountability, of replacing the specific, named, documented reality of individual deaths with a generalized gesture of recognition that required no one to be held responsible for anything specific. The use of propaganda during the First World War was not new in kind, but was unprecedented in scale and systematization, and it produced habits of information management that became templates for everything that followed. The British War Office, the French Service de la Presse, and their equivalents in Germany and Austria-Hungary all operated censorship and propaganda systems of considerable sophistication. Newspapers were prevented from publishing casualty figures accurately. Photographs of dead British soldiers were banned from British publications throughout the war. Reports from the front were subject to military censorship that removed any information that might reduce recruitment or civilian morale. The official casualty reports consistently understated losses and sometimes falsified the nature of engagements to suggest tactical success where none had occurred. This was not simply lying for temporary advantage. It was the construction of a parallel reality, an official version of the war that existed alongside the actual war and was maintained with institutional rigor. The soldiers who returned on leave found that the civilian population inhabited a different version of events than the one they had experienced. This created a specific kind of alienation, the sense that the truth of what they had lived through was not just unknown to those at home, but actively displaced by a managed fiction. The habit this normalized was the habit of institutional reality management, the practice of treating the official narrative as the functional reality regardless of its relationship to observable fact, and the corresponding habit among those with direct knowledge of treating their own experience as somehow illegitimate, as less real than the version that appeared in newspapers. Letters home from soldiers were censored by officers who read them before dispatch and blacked out anything that violated security or morale considerations. The result was that soldiers learned to write letters that navigated the censorship, that communicated in coded language or omission, or the particular quality of reassurance that told a careful reader everything by saying nothing worrying. The letters of soldiers who served on the Western Front are, when read carefully, documents of extraordinary sophistication in the management of truth. They describe the weather. They request specific items from home. They ask after named individuals and animals and local events with an attention to domestic detail that seems out of proportion until you understand that the domestic detail was the point, that by filling the letter with the specificity of home, the soldier was maintaining a connection to a life that the war was systematically destroying. The habit of strategic omission, of managing the information available to those who depended on you in order to protect them from truths they could not help with, was a habit that veterans practiced during the war and often continued practicing afterward. Men who came home with severe psychological damage frequently told their families nothing about what they had experienced, not from inability to speak necessarily, but from the trained habit of protective omission that the war had made automatic. The relationship between soldiers and alcohol on the Western Front was formalized to a degree that reveals a great deal about the military's understanding of the conditions it was imposing on its men. The British Army issued a rum ration. It was distributed daily in cold or wet conditions and before major operations. The standard issue was about 1/8 of a pint of service rum, a dark, high-proof product that delivered a rapid effect, which was the point. The rum ration was not intended to provide pleasure or reward. It was intended to produce a specific physiological state, enough warmth and mild disinhibition to allow men to function in conditions that their unmodified nervous systems found intolerable. The practice was open, official, bureaucratically administered. Officers signed for it. Quartermasters tracked it. The acknowledgement embedded in the practice was significant, that sober, fully conscious human beings could not reliably be induced to advance across open ground into machine gun fire without some chemical assistance. This acknowledgement did not produce any reflection on whether the operations being conducted were humane or rational. It produced a rum ration. the habit of chemical management of human distress, the institutional practice of using substances to maintain operational function in people whose systems were rejecting the conditions they were operating in, was another product of the war that found wider application in the century that followed. The field punishment system of the British Army during the First World War was another mechanism of institutional habit formation that deserves direct description. Field punishment number 1, the most severe grade of punishment short of death, involved strapping the offender spread-eagled to a fixed object, often a gunwheel or a post, for up to 2 hours per day, for up to 21 days. This was done in view of other soldiers, in all weather conditions, sometimes within range of enemy fire. The offences for which it was prescribed included cowardice, insubordination, desertion, sleeping on post, and various forms of military negligence. The practice had been inherited from Victorian military tradition and was applied in the First World War to a conscript army, to men who had not chosen military service and who were being punished for failures that were in many cases direct products of the psychological damage the war had already inflicted on them. The habit it produced was not primarily fear of punishment, though that was present. It was the habit of witnessing formal, official degradation and understanding that the institution producing it held the legal and physical power to enforce its will regardless of any moral objection. The soldiers who watched field punishment number 1 being administered were being taught something specific about the nature of the institution they served, about where they stood within it, and about the relationship between institutional authority and individual humanity. That lesson, taught repeatedly and systematically to millions of men, was another of the war's durable products. The handling of deserters and men charged with cowardice represents perhaps the most stark example of how the war managed the human beings who refused, consciously or unconsciously, to continue. The British Army executed 306 soldiers during the First World War for offences including desertion, cowardice, quitting a post, and striking a superior officer. The actual number of men who broke under the strain of trench warfare and were unable to continue was far larger. Most were returned to their units after varying degrees of punishment or treatment. The executions that did occur followed a standard procedure. A court-martial, typically brief, typically conducted with inadequate legal representation for the accused, followed by a sentence, followed by confirmation by senior command, followed by dawn execution by firing squad drawn from the condemned man's own unit. The selection of the firing squad from the unit was deliberate. It made the execution a collective act, implicating the witnesses and participants in the institutional enforcement. The men selected for firing squads were not volunteers, they were ordered. Some were given rifles loaded with blanks to allow the possibility of not being the one who fired a fatal round, though in practice this was a psychological gesture rather than a functional one. The habit being manufactured through this practice was the habit of institutional compliance under conditions where personal morality pointed in a different direction, the habit of following an order that one recognized as wrong because the consequence of not following it was severe, and because the institution had structured the situation so that individual resistance was both dangerous and futile. The management of time on the Western Front produced a specific psychological condition that became one of the most widely noted features of veteran behavior. In the trenches, time had a different structure than it had in civilian life. The long stretches of waiting, the sudden explosive compression of action, the routine of the daily cycle that continued regardless of what had happened in the previous 24 hours, all of this produced a relationship with time that was fundamentally different from the relationship most men had brought with them from civilian life. Men frequently described a loss of the sense of future, not depression exactly, though depression was common enough. Rather, a specific narrowing of temporal horizon, a condition in which only the immediate present was real and in which planning beyond the next hour or the next stand-to was psychologically impossible, because the future was genuinely uncertain in a way that civilian life rarely was. The habit this produced was a specific form of present-tense living that many veterans found impossible to abandon after the war. The inability to plan, to invest in a future that felt abstract and contingent, to commit to long-term projects or relationships, was noted by the families of veterans and by the physicians who treated them. It was also noted and condemned as a failure of initiative or ambition, which was another example of the cultural habit of misinterpreting the products of the war's damage as personal moral deficiency. The relationship between the men of the trenches and their officers was not simply hierarchical. It was shaped by the specific conditions of trench warfare in ways that produced a particular set of social habits. The junior officer, the subaltern, was in a peculiar position. He was responsible for the welfare and discipline of the men under his command. He shared most of their physical conditions, and he led from the front during any assault, which gave him a casualty rate significantly higher than the men he commanded. The average life expectancy of a junior officer on the Western Front during periods of active fighting was measurable in weeks. This produced a specific social dynamic. The men under command of a good officer, one who was competent and who demonstrably shared their dangers and attended to their welfare, developed a protective loyalty toward him that went beyond normal military discipline. They looked out for him. They told him things that the official chain of command might not have passed upward. They covered for him in ways they would not have covered for a senior officer who stayed behind the line. The habit this produced was a specific form of institutional loyalty that attached to individuals rather than to the organization itself. A habit of distinguishing between the person who earned genuine authority through shared experience and the institution that conferred formal authority through rank. This habit of distinguishing earned from conferred authority was politically significant in the post-war world, where many veterans found themselves deeply skeptical of institutional claims to legitimacy and drew sharply on their wartime experience of the difference between authority that was real and authority that was merely official. The censorship of death notices and casualty announcements during the First World War was systematic and extended well beyond the battlefield. Families at home received official telegrams informing them of deaths, but those telegrams typically contained minimal information: name, rank, unit, date. The cause of death, the location of the burial if there was one, the circumstances of the final hours were rarely included. The casualty clearing stations maintained records, but those records were incomplete, inconsistently kept, and not routinely communicated to families. The graves registration units maintained burial records, but those records were not automatically provided to next of kin. Families who wanted to know more about how their sons and husbands had died, where they were buried, whether they had suffered, had to navigate a bureaucratic system that was not designed to provide this information, and that was in some cases actively structured to prevent it from being provided, because the details of deaths on the Western Front were frequently such that their accurate communication would have been damaging to morale and recruitment. The habit this normalized was the institutional withholding of information from those directly affected by institutional decisions. The practice of treating the details of a person's death as administrative data that belonged to the institution rather than to the family, of managing grief through information control. This habit found application in other institutional contexts throughout the 20th century. The physical landscape of the Western Front produced its own specific set of sensory habits and aversions. The smell of the trenches is documented in virtually every memoir produced by veterans, described in consistent terms: a compound of mud, cordite, rotting organic matter, unwashed bodies, chloride of lime used for sanitation, and underlying all of it, the specific and unmistakable smell of decomposing human flesh. This smell was not occasional or peripheral. It was constant, pervasive, the background condition of life in the trenches. Men learned to live within it as they learned to live within the noise and the cold and the hunger, through a process of desensitization that required the suppression of normal revulsion. The habit of suppressing the physical signal of revulsion, of overriding the body's ordinary response to conditions that the body correctly identified as dangerous and intolerable, was a central skill of trench survival, and one that produced lasting physiological effects. Veterans described specific smells, encountered years later in entirely different contexts, that triggered an immediate physical recall of the trenches, the smell of wet earth, of particular chemicals, of certain foods that had been part of the trench diet. The body had learned associations during the war that it did not forget, because the associations had been formed under conditions of extreme stress, which is precisely the condition under which the nervous system creates its most durable, learned responses. The communication systems of the Western Front were as central to the war's function as its weapons, and the habits produced by those systems were distinctive. The primary means of communication between frontline units and rear headquarters was the field telephone, which ran on cables buried in the ground. Those cables were vulnerable to artillery fire and constantly being cut and repaired. The secondary means was the runner, a soldier whose job was to carry messages on foot through terrain under fire. The casualty rate among runners was high enough to make the position one of the more dangerous on the Western Front. The habits produced by unreliable communication were specific: a tendency to plan for the failure of communication rather than its success, to build redundancy into every instruction, to treat the absence of information as itself informative, and to make decisions on the basis of incomplete information without waiting for confirmation that would not reliably come. These were rational adaptations to the conditions of trench warfare, and they were habits that shaped the military planning culture not just of the First World War, but of everything that came after. The management of uncertainty through procedural redundancy, the institutional habit of preparing for communication failure as a default condition, became a standard feature of military and later civilian operational planning, a direct inheritance from the communications environment of the Western Front. The use of dogs in the First World War was extensive, systematic, and produced a specific cultural artifact that persists. Dogs were used for message carrying, for detecting gas, for locating wounded men in no man's land, for pulling small carts, and for general mascot functions. The relationship between soldiers and their unit dogs was noted by observers at the time as something more than the standard human-animal affiliation. The dog represented a connection to a domestic world that everything else about the war was designed to destroy. It had a name. It showed individual loyalty. It did not understand the war, and was therefore innocent of it in a way that no human participant could be. The death of a unit's dog was treated by the men with a degree of grief that was sometimes disproportionate in numerical terms to their response to the deaths of their comrades. And this was understood at the time as not disproportionate at all, but as a precise measure of what had been normalized. The deaths of men had been administratively processed into familiarity. The death of the dog had not. The habit this reflects is the human capacity to grieve most openly for the loss that falls outside the administrative framework, for the loss that has not been pre-categorized as expected and manageable. The physical deformities produced by the First World War, primarily by the combination of artillery wounds, gas damage, and surgical interventions under field conditions, drove developments in reconstructive medicine and prosthetic technology that constituted one of the war's more practically significant legacies. Harold Gillies, working at the Queen's Hospital in Sidcup, developed the techniques of modern reconstructive surgery in direct response to the facial injuries produced by artillery and small arms fire. The scale of need was unprecedented. Thousands of men had lost portions of their faces, and the social and psychological consequences of that loss in a culture that had no established framework for publicly disfigured men were severe. The hospital at Sidcup served men who could not go to restaurants or public spaces because of the response their appearance produced in others. Gillies and his colleagues developed techniques of tissue grafting and structural reconstruction that became the foundation of modern plastic surgery, and they did so under industrial conditions, processing cases at a rate that traditional surgical practice had never approached. The habit being formed here was the habit of treating the human face as technically repairable, of applying engineering logic to what had previously been understood as irreversible physical damage. This habit produced genuine medical advances. It also produced the framework within which human appearance became, gradually, a domain of technical intervention rather than natural fact. a domain in which the line between repair and enhancement was initially clear, and over time became very much less so. The production of the Western Front as an environment required the labor of millions of men who were not primarily fighting. The infrastructure of the trenches, the constant digging and draining and reinforcing and repairing, was work in the most literal sense, and it was performed by the soldiers themselves under conditions that differed from ordinary manual labor, primarily in that artillery fire was a constant possibility, and that the men doing the work had not chosen it and could not refuse it. The labor requirement of the trenches produced a specific egalitarianism of exhaustion. Officers and enlisted men alike were required to participate in the physical maintenance of the position, though the proportion of labor fell much more heavily on the enlisted ranks. The habit this produced was a specific understanding of the relationship between physical work and survival, a learned connection between the maintenance of a living environment and the possibility of continuing to live in it, that was expressed in the almost ritualistic attention many veterans gave to maintenance and upkeep throughout the rest of their lives. The polished boots, the maintained tools, the obsessive orderliness of some veterans' domestic environments were not merely military habits carried over from training. They were habits formed in conditions where the failure to maintain a drainage channel or reinforce a section of trench wall could mean drowning or collapse, where maintenance was not a preference but a condition of survival. The statistical management of the Western Front required the development of what amounts to modern military bureaucracy. The scale of the operations, the number of units, the complexity of supply, the management of manpower, the tracking of equipment and ammunition and casualties, all of this required organizational systems that had not previously existed in any military structure. The British Army grew from a small professional force of roughly 250,000 men in 1914 to a mass army of nearly 5 million at its peak, and the administrative infrastructure required to manage that expansion had to be built from nothing in months. The habits this required, and the habits it produced, were the habits of modern large-scale administration, the standardization of forms, the hierarchical processing of information, the division of administrative labor, the creation of specialist functions, the management of individuals through their records rather than through direct acquaintance. The soldier in the mass army of 1914 to 1918 was, in administrative terms, a record. He had a number. His medical history was documented. His conduct was rated. His performance was assessed. His death was registered. The specific human being behind the record was relevant to the immediate unit in which he served, but was largely irrelevant to the administrative machinery that managed the force as a whole. The habit of managing large numbers of people as records, of treating the documented representation of a person as the administratively relevant version of that person, was not invented by the First World War, but it was practiced at a scale during the war that made it normal in a way it had not been before. The particular quality of boredom that the trenches produced was different from ordinary boredom in a way that matters. It was not the boredom of inactivity alone. It was boredom combined with sustained, low-level fear, with physical discomfort, with the knowledge that the boredom could end at any moment in violent death. This compound state produced specific psychological adaptations. Men became extraordinarily inventive in creating occupation. They played cards to the point of obsession. They constructed elaborate trench newspapers. They carved objects from wood and shell casings. They staged theatrical performances in dugouts barely large enough to stand in. They developed intricate systems of betting on events as trivial as the behavior of rats or the timing of daily artillery patterns. The habit these activities produced was not primarily entertainment. It was the habit of creating structured meaning within environments that had been emptied of natural meaning, of filling time with activity that acknowledged the absurdity of the situation while insisting on the importance of structure anyway. This habit is recognizable in the behavior of people in many subsequent situations of institutional confinement, from prisoner of war camps to civilian internment, from hospital wards to prisons, and it is recognizable because the First World War was where it was developed at scale and documented with enough detail to become a model. The armistice of November 1918 was experienced by most soldiers on the Western Front not as jubilation, but as a kind of blankness. The accounts in letters and diaries from November 11, 1918, are strikingly consistent in describing not celebration, but silence, confusion, and a profound disorientation produced by the removal of the single organizing principle that had structured their existence for years. The war had ended. The guns had stopped, and the men who had been trained to survive within the war's structure found themselves standing in a landscape that was still physically the landscape of war, still cratered and wire-strewn and full of the dead, in which the administrative and psychological context that had given those conditions meaning had been abruptly removed. The transition back to civilian life was managed with the same bureaucratic efficiency that had characterized everything else about the war's administration. Men were demobilized in sequence, processed out, given a small sum of money and, in some cases, a suit of civilian clothes, and returned to a society that had been living within the official version of the war for 4 years and had no framework for accommodating what they had actually experienced. The habit this normalized was the habit of transition without support, of institutional management of the exit from an overwhelming experience that consisted entirely of administrative processing and contained no acknowledgement of the psychological reality of what was being transitioned out of. This habit became the template for the management of returning soldiers in every subsequent conflict, adjusted incrementally over the course of a century, but recognizable in its basic architecture. The language of the First World War produced terms that are now so embedded in everyday English that their origins are invisible. Over the top, 0 hour, shell shock, no man's land, dugout, strafe, the whole 9 yards, blighty, cushy, fed up. These are words and phrases that entered civilian English directly from the trenches and have remained there, used daily by people who have no awareness of their origin in a specific mode of organized killing. The habit this represents is one of the war's strangest legacies, the normalization of trench warfare's vocabulary as ordinary English, the absorption of the language of industrial slaughter into everyday speech without any acknowledgement of what that language originally described. When someone describes a challenge as taking them over the top, they are using the language of an order that sent men into artillery fire and machine gun fire across open ground. When someone describes a problem as a real blighty, they are using the word that soldiers use to describe a wound serious enough to get them sent home from the front, a wound they had been hoping for. The vocabulary of the war is still with us, emptied of its specific content, worn smooth by ordinary use. Another product of the war that persists without attribution. The international system that emerged from the First World War, the League of Nations, the redrawing of borders, the management of empire, the construction of a peace that was not peace but postponement, was built on the administrative habits the war had produced. The Paris Peace Conference of 1919 was managed by professional bureaucracies using the record-keeping systems the war had developed. The decisions made there, the partition of the Middle East, the humiliation of Germany, the recognition of new national entities in Eastern Europe, the continuation of colonial arrangements under new names, were all made through the same basic process that had managed everything else about the war. The conversion of human and territorial realities into administrative categories, the management of populations through classification, the treatment of the immediate problem without sustained attention to the conditions that would produce the next problem. The habit was not new. It was the habit of all political administration. What was new was the scale at which it was applied and the degree to which the particular administrative culture of the war, its comfort with the processing of human beings as units, its indifference to individual experience as administratively relevant, had shaped the people doing the processing. The peace that followed the First World War was built by people who had spent 4 years learning to manage mass human reality through bureaucratic systems. And the peace had the qualities of those systems: organized, internally consistent, and ultimately indifferent to the human consequences of its own logic. The graves of the Western Front, maintained now by the Commonwealth War Graves Commission and its French and German equivalents, are among the most ordered landscapes on Earth. Row after row of identical white stones, each precisely spaced, each bearing a name or the legend known unto God, each set in lawn, maintained to standards that would satisfy any formal garden. The order is deliberate. It was designed to communicate equality in death, to neutralize the class distinctions that had structured everything about the living army, to suggest that the administrative processing of the dead had resulted in a kind of democratic dignity. The order also communicates something else, something that may not have been entirely intended: the scale of the operation. The Tyne-Cot Cemetery in Belgium contains nearly 12,000 graves. The Thiepval Memorial to the Missing of the Somme lists the names of 72,000 men who were killed on the Somme and have no known grave. The memorials of the Western Front, in their ordered, maintained precision, make the mathematics of the war legible in a way that the war itself rarely was. They are the final form of the administrative systems that processed the dead, and they represent, in their extraordinary organization, the most enduring artifact of the habit that the war most thoroughly established: the practice of managing human death at industrial scale without pausing to ask what the purpose of the scale had been. The stones are still being placed. The records are still being updated. New identifications are made each year as forensic technology advances, and the ground of the Western Front continues to yield its contents. The administrative work of the First World War is not finished.